Imagine stumbling upon the ruins of a city that shouldn't exist, not because the ground swallowed it whole, though in many ways it did, but because everything about it defies what we thought we knew about the ancient world. The streets are too straight, the drainage systems are too sophisticated, the buildings are too precisely planned. You look at what's left, and a single question forms in your mind that no historian has been able to fully answer. How did people living thousands of years ago build something like this, and then disappear without leaving us a clear reason why? That question sits at the heart of one of archaeology's most enduring mysteries. The city in question is Mohenjo-daro, a sprawling urban center located in what is now modern-day Pakistan, along the banks of the ancient Indus River. It was built roughly 4,500 years ago, placing it squarely among the world's earliest civilizations, contemporaries of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. But while those cultures left behind pyramids, temples, and written epics that proudly declared their achievements, Mohenjo-daro did something far quieter, and in many ways far more remarkable. It built a functioning city that, in terms of civic engineering and urban design, would not be matched anywhere in the world for centuries. When archaeologists first began excavating the site in the 1920s, they expected to find something modest. Perhaps a small settlement, a few pottery shards, the usual traces of early human habitation. What they uncovered instead stopped them cold. Mohenjo-daro was not a village. It was a metropolis, home to somewhere between 40,000 and 100,000 people at its peak. It had wide, grid-patterned streets laid out with such geometric precision that it's difficult to attribute it to anything other than deliberate, large-scale urban planning. The city was divided into distinct districts, a lower city for residential and commercial life, and a raised citadel at the center housing what appeared to be administrative or ceremonial structures. But the engineering is where things get truly astonishing. Mohenjo-daro had a citywide sanitation and drainage system that was, without exaggeration, ahead of its time by millennia. Almost every home, not just the wealthy ones, almost every home was connected to a sophisticated network of covered brick drains running beneath the streets. Wastewater flowed out of houses into these channels, which directed it away from the city in an organized, deliberate fashion. There were public wells distributed throughout the residential areas so that clean water was accessible across different parts of the city, not concentrated in one central location. There were large, standardized brick structures that researchers believe may have functioned as public baths or water reservoirs. The Great Bath, one of the most famous features of the site, is a watertight, carefully constructed pool that suggests ritualistic or communal water use was central to the society's life. The standardization itself is one of the most quietly jaw-dropping aspects of the Indus Valley Civilization that Mohenjo-daro represents. Bricks used in construction across thousands of square miles of territory, from Mohenjo-daro to sites hundreds of miles away, followed the same precise ratio of dimensions. That level of consistency across such distances implies not just shared knowledge, but organized coordination. These people had systems of weights and measures that were uniform across their entire civilization. Their trade networks stretched from Mesopotamia to Central Asia, and the goods they exchanged, including carnelian beads, shell ornaments, and cotton textiles, reflected a level of craft specialization that demands a structured economic foundation beneath it. What made the archaeological discoveries even more unsettling for historians was what Mohenjo-daro challenged about the established narrative of ancient progress. For a long time, the assumption was that technological and civic advancement followed a recognizable arc. That complex urban infrastructure was something civilizations built up to slowly, visibly, with clear precursors. Mohenjo-daro complicated that story. It appeared seemingly fully formed with systems already in place that most of the ancient world would not develop for another 1,000 years or more. There were no grand temples to warrior kings, no massive monuments to royal egos, just a city, brilliantly organized, built at a scale and sophistication that suggested its builders understood exactly what they were doing. And then they were gone, not slowly, not in a way that left behind clear warnings or obvious transitions. The city was abandoned. The drainage systems fell silent. The streets that had been so carefully maintained were left to fill with debris. The people who had built one of the ancient world's most livable urban environments simply ceased to occupy it and left behind no definitive record of why. That absence is what makes Mohenjo-daro so haunting. We can walk its streets in a sense, trace the outlines of homes and workshops and public spaces. We can see the intelligence embedded in every drainage channel and every standardized brick. We can understand that these were capable, organized, deeply sophisticated people. What we cannot understand, not yet, not fully, is how a society that advanced could vanish so completely. That's the question the ruins are still waiting to answer. So, let's walk through what the evidence actually shows us, because the ruins of Mohenjo-daro are not silent. They're speaking. We're just still learning to interpret the language. Start with the physical layout of the city itself. The grid system wasn't accidental or approximate. The main streets ran roughly north to south and east to west, with narrower lanes branching off at right angles to serve individual neighborhoods. This kind of deliberate orientation suggests surveying, planning, and a centralized decision about how the city would grow before the first brick was ever laid. The uniformity of those bricks, as mentioned, extended across the entire Indus Valley Civilization. That standard ratio of roughly 1:2 to 4 in height, width, and length appears at site after site across a region spanning more than 500,000 square miles. That's not coincidence. That's standardization, and standardization implies authority, whether governmental, economic, or cultural. The artifacts pulled from the soil deepen the picture considerably. Thousands of small square seals carved from steatite have been recovered, each one bearing intricate images of animals, bulls, elephants, rhinoceroses, a mysterious figure that some researchers interpret as a proto-deity sitting in a yogic posture, alongside symbols from a script that still hasn't been deciphered. These seals were almost certainly used in trade, stamped into clay as markers of identity or ownership. What they tell us is that commerce was organized, that identity was formalized, and that literacy of some kind existed in this society. The frustrating part is that we still cannot read what they wrote. The Indus script, with somewhere between 400 and 600 distinct signs, has resisted every serious decipherment attempt for nearly a century. That gap in our knowledge is enormous. It means we have the bones of this civilization, but not its voice. The residential areas reveal a society with a remarkable sense of civic equality, at least compared to its contemporaries. Unlike Mesopotamian cities of the same era, which were organized around massive temple complexes and royal palaces that announced hierarchy in stone, Mohenjo-daro shows relatively uniform housing. There were larger homes and smaller ones, certainly, but no structure has been identified that archaeologists can confidently call a palace or a royal tomb. No ruler's name has been found. No warrior class has been clearly identified in the burial record. The city appears to have functioned through some form of organized governance that left no individual ego behind for us to study. Whether that represents a kind of early civic democracy, a theocratic administration, or simply an elite that didn't advertise itself in the ways we're accustomed to finding, remains genuinely unknown. Now, the signs of disruption. This is where the story becomes more complicated and more contested. In the upper layers of Mohenjo-daro, the layers that represent the city's final centuries of occupation, roughly between 1900 and 1700 BCE, archaeologists have found clear evidence that the city was in decline long before it was fully abandoned. The quality of construction deteriorated noticeably. Buildings that had once been carefully planned and well constructed were subdivided, hastily modified, and crowded in ways that suggest population pressure or reduced civic oversight. Drainage systems that had been maintained with such obvious care began to fall into disrepair. Pottery quality declined. The careful urban planning that had defined the city's peak gave way to something messier, more improvised. There are also skeletal remains that have generated significant debate. A collection of human skeletons found in the upper levels of the site, sometimes called the massacre victims, were discovered in positions suggesting sudden, violent death. Some with apparent trauma marks, some left unburied or haphazardly grouped together. For decades, this was taken as evidence of an external attack, a violent end. More recent analysis has complicated that interpretation considerably. Forensic re-examination has shown that the skeletons come from different time periods, not a single catastrophic event. Some researchers now argue they represent accumulated deaths during a prolonged period of crisis rather than a single massacre. The narrative of a dramatic violent conquest has largely been set aside, though not entirely. What most archaeologists currently agree on is that the city's decline was likely multi-causal and gradual rather than sudden and singular. Evidence points towards significant environmental stress. Studies of ancient river systems suggest that the Harappa River, which once supported much of the Indus Valley, was shifting or drying out during this period. Flood layers found at Mohenjo-daro suggest the city dealt with repeated inundations over time, and the effort of rebuilding after each one may have steadily eroded the community's resources and will. What remains genuinely uncertain is the sequence, the weight of each cause, and whether the people of Mohenjo-daro had any sense of what was happening to them. Did they leave in organized waves, carrying their knowledge and their seals to other places? Did they scatter as crisis compounded on crisis? The city didn't explode. It seems to have slowly exhaled. And understanding exactly why that breath finally ran out is the puzzle that continues to pull researchers back to this place, season after season, with better tools and stubbornly incomplete answers. That puzzle, the one that pulls researchers back season after season, doesn't have a clean solution. And the more carefully you examine the available theories, the more you realize that the absence of a clean solution is itself one of the most important things this city has to tell us. Let's work through the leading explanations because each one carries real weight and each one also has a limit. The climate shift argument is probably the most widely accepted among researchers today. Paleoclimatic data suggests that around 2000 BCE, the monsoon patterns that fed the rivers and farmland of the Indus region began to weaken and shift eastward. The Harappa River system, which some scholars believe may be the ancient Sarasvati of Vedic texts, appears to have been drying up over centuries. Without reliable water, agriculture fails. Without agriculture, a city of tens of thousands cannot feed itself. The evidence here is genuinely compelling. Sediment cores, satellite imagery of ancient riverbeds, and botanical studies of pollen records all point towards serious environmental stress. The weakness of this theory is timing and geography. Climate change happened across the entire region. Yet the Indus cities didn't all collapse simultaneously or in the same way. Some settlements actually saw population growth during the same period, as people may have migrated eastward toward the Gangetic Plains. Climate stress accelerated something, but it doesn't fully explain the specific trajectory of any individual city. The war or invasion theory is the one with the most dramatic appeal and, increasingly, the least evidentiary support. For a while, the Indo-Aryan migration hypothesis, the idea that incoming groups from Central Asia overwhelmed and destroyed Indus cities, was used to explain the collapse. The problem is, the archaeology doesn't cooperate. There are no widespread destruction layers, no burned administrative buildings, no mass graves consistent with conquest. The skeletal evidence that once seemed to point toward a massacre has been reinterpreted as gradual accumulation rather than a single violent event. External attack might have played a role in some areas at some moments, but as a primary cause, it has steadily lost ground. Political collapse is harder to test but impossible to dismiss. We know this society had some form of centralized coordination. You don't standardize bricks across 500,000 square miles without it. But we have no idea what that system actually looked like or how it was maintained. What we do know is that complex administrative systems can fail internally through corruption, inequality, factionalism, or simply the slow erosion of the trust and cooperation that makes collective governance possible. If the coordinating authority weakened, the infrastructure that depended on it, the drainage systems, the granaries, the trade networks, could have begun to deteriorate without anyone necessarily intending it. The evidence for this is mostly negative, which is the worst kind. We see the decay in the upper layers of the city, but we can't see the political decisions or conflicts that may have produced it. Resource failure and trade disruption round out the major theories. Mohenjo-daro was part of a vast trading network that stretched to Mesopotamia, and there's evidence that Indus trade goods appeared in Sumerian cities. If that trade faltered, whether from political instability in Mesopotamia, shifts in what was valuable, or disruptions in the supply chains, the economic foundation of an already stressed city could have crumbled quickly. Again, the evidence is suggestive but not conclusive. Here's what all of these theories taken together actually tell us. No single explanation is sufficient because single explanations rarely are. What likely happened to Mohenjo-daro was a convergence. Environmental stress, pressing on agricultural capacity, a political system that may have been less resilient than its engineering suggested, economic networks that were sensitive to disruption, and a population that ultimately chose, gradually and probably without a single decisive moment, to stop maintaining a city that was becoming harder to sustain. The city didn't end. It emptied. And that, perhaps, is the most unsettling part of this story for us today. Mohenjo-daro was genuinely advanced. Its engineers solved problems in urban planning, sanitation, and standardization that most contemporary civilizations hadn't even posed as questions yet. None of that was sufficient protection against the compounding weight of environmental, political, and economic stress. Sophistication does not confer permanence. Complexity can become fragility when the conditions that supported it begin to shift. That isn't just a lesson from the ancient past. It's a pattern that keeps reasserting itself across human history, and it's one that an advanced society should probably take seriously rather than assume it has outgrown. We are still learning to read what Mohenjo-daro is saying. The script remains undeciphered. The governance remains unnamed. The exact sequence of its decline remains contested. What isn't contested is that something remarkable existed here, flourished for centuries, and then came apart in ways its inhabitants may never have fully understood. So here's what I want to leave you with, and I genuinely want to know your answer. Which of these theories do you find most convincing? Climate, collapse, conflict, economics, or some combination we haven't fully mapped yet? Drop it in the comments because this is exactly the kind of question that doesn't have a settled answer, and the conversation around it is still very much alive.